Hi all, and welcome back to another episode of Efficio's Transforming Public Procurement Microcast series, where we continue to share insights to help you better understand the new Procurement Act regulations. Following on from last week's episode, where we discussed terminating a procurement, this week I'm joined by Kieron Hazell, a consultant from our public sector practice, to deep dive into contract modifications. Welcome, Kieron. So what's changing here in terms of the grounds under which contracts may be modified?
Hi, Jack. Firstly, thanks for having me on the series. So yes, the previous regs, PCR 2015, permitted certain modifications to be made without triggering a new procurement. There are 6 such existing grounds from those regs, such as unforeseeable circumstances and additional goods, services, or works. The new Act now introduces 4 new grounds for modification, 2 of which are specific to defence. The non-defence ones are, firstly, urgency and the protection of life, and secondly, materialisation of a known risk. And for defence authority contracts, we have grounds based on developments in technology and ensuring continuous supply.
Okay, that's clear. So focusing on some of the existing grounds there, how have some of these been changed under the new Act?
Sure. So I think unforeseeable circumstances is a good one to talk about. The detailed grounds under which a modification may be made here are unchanged. However, there are changes to how the 50% amendment value cap is calculated. So changes under the Act may now be made successively, allowing for multiple separate modifications of increasing value, each individually up to 50% of the immediately preceding value of the contract rather than the original value.
Okay, that's interesting. So do you have a worked example of that?
Yeah, of course. So imagine you have a contract with an original value of £1 million and the value of a modification is 600k. Under the old regs for unforeseen circumstances, that wouldn't be allowed. But under the new regs, say the current value of that contract goes from 1 million to 1.4 million due to other changes under inflation, then a new modification of 600k would be permitted as it would be under 50% of the current value.
Okay, thanks for that. So in theory, this does give potential for exponentially larger contract values in the future. And I think it's worth adding that this principle of assessing against the latest estimate value of the contract immediately before the modification applies to other existing grounds too, such as below threshold modifications and additional goods, services, or works. So Kieron, in terms of the new grounds, what can you tell us here briefly?
Sure. So in terms of the new grounds, I think the materialisation of a known risk is worth mentioning. Certain information must be provided in the original tender or transparency notice in order to use this modification. It's important to note that the risk must be identified as risk which could jeopardise the satisfactory performance of the contract. And secondly, you need to reference that the possibility of a modification under this ground may be required. So assuming that the risk had been correctly provided for in the original tender or transparency notice, you can make a modification to deal with the materialisation of it.
Okay, great. And do any conditions need to be met here before we use this modification ground then?
Yes, that's correct. There are several conditions. For instance, the contract cannot be performed to the authority's satisfaction without this change. That the 50% amendment rule, which we mentioned, isn't going to be breached. Or, for instance, that awarding a new contract to deal with this risk would not be in the public interest. For instance, it wouldn't provide better value for money or may cause technical issues.
Okay, thanks for that, Kieron. That's a really useful overview into the new approach to contract modifications and the permitted grounds for doing so. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this is used in practice. I hope everyone enjoyed today's microcast. As always, please do post any thoughts, questions in the chat and get in touch with Kieron or myself for future topics you also want to hear about. We'll see you all next week.